Welcome to the Fantasy Champions Fantasy Football Podcast. Here's your host, Morgan Colby and Rick Lemon.
What's going on, Fantasy Champs? I'm back. Another start and sit show without Rick. Oh, I'm going to do the next two, actually, the starts and the sits. He's going to do trade targets, and he'll get that to you guys coming up on another show. But what I have for you today is starts for the week. Players that you have to start in your starting lineup going into week 4. I can't believe it's already week 4 on the season, but we're going to bring you that content coming soon. Like I said, Rick's not with us today. My name is Morgan Colby, though, if I did not say that earlier. It's been an interesting week. I did happen to watch Thursday Night Football last night, and my goodness, my friends, CeeDee Lamb, 20 points in the first half, ended with 3, so not happy about that. I did tweet that I was hoping that he got 40. I was being a little greedy, and he did not. So hopefully you enjoyed Thursday Night Football, got what you wanted out of your fantasy players. But yeah, so I'm going to bring you 6 players that you must start for week 4. And then I'll send you on your merry way. Make sure to listen to tomorrow's episode as well, where we talk about our must-sit players for the week. Before we do that, please follow us on any social media platform. Just type in the FF Champs Fantasy Champions. You can also follow me on Twitter. I think it's Morgan Colby _FF, so you can check me out there. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or any other podcast platforms, please leave a review. Share this pod with your friends. If you're watching on YouTube, you know what to do. Subscribe. Hit the subscribe button. Stop right now. Hit subscribe. Click the bell for notifications. Like and comment down below any questions you may have. We love the comments. They help the show. They help the viewership. So please leave comments. They're great. All right, let's talk about 6 players you got to get in your lineup this week. 6 must-start players for week 4. Week 4, baby. Can't believe it's already week 4, like I said. We're flying through the NFL season. I was thinking about it the other day. I was like, we're through a quarter of the season already. The NFL season flies by, man. But yeah, week 4. Excited. So let's talk about some starts. I'm excited to bring you this content today. We're going to start with a number 1 or start with the running backs at least. Number 1, Najee Harris from the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, Najee's been a weird play in PPR leagues because he's kind of, I want to say, underperformed. Or not underperformed. He's kind of performed exactly where he needs to perform in fantasy football, but, I'll rephrase that. He's performed exactly how you would expect him to perform in fantasy football on a Steelers offense that can't really score. But he had 8 points week 1, 20 carries, 70 yards. 8 points week 2, 17 carries, 69 yards. And then 13 points week 3, where he ended up catching 5 passes for 16 yards, and then he had 18 rushes for 70 yards on the ground. So he's been consistently getting 70 yards, consistently around 4 yards a carry. So hasn't been like a horrible start for him on the season. I think the big problem for him is obviously the cap on the touchdown upside. Like, because they don't get in the red zone a lot, because they don't provide a lot of scoring upside, Najee then in turn does not get that. If he starts getting the pass catching work that we saw from this past game, where obviously not hyper efficient, 5 catches for 16 yards is abysmal. That's 3.2 yards per catch. That's horrible. Obviously you want to see better than that, but if he does start to catch 3 to 5 passes a game, you can start to see those totals increase, and he'll consistently, as long as he's healthy, get you 12 fantasy points in a game. But there are a couple of big notes surrounding Najee Harris. The first one is I'm 90% sure. Let me just confirm this information right now. But Jaylen Warren, I think, is out coming up this week. He's out. He's out for this week. On Friday, they ruled him out for Sunday's game against the Indianapolis Colts. So with Jaylen Warren, now the big thing with Warren is that he's gotten 31, 48, and 34% of the snaps, but really hasn't taken too much of the workload away from Najee in most instances. So like he's not going to, like Najee's not going to take a ton of work from him, but I think the one thing that he'll get is pass catching, which is good for Najee. So you're going to see Najee jump from like around 55 to 60% snap percentage up into the range of 70 to 80% snap percentage. I don't see another running back there that can kind of take that on. But so that's kind of the first thing, obviously, with Jaylen Warren out. He is facing the Indianapolis Colts this week, who have allowed the most rushing yards to the running back position this season. So the Colts are not a tough opponent fantasy points wise through 3 weeks. Indy has given up a total of, I want to say, 20 points per game to the running back position. Yeah, 20 points per game. So he's going to get a lot of rushing yards. Joe Mixon and Josh Jacobs both ran for 150 yards against them on the season already. So I think at this point, he's a pretty safe start. I just don't know what his touchdown upside in this game is going to be. If he gets 100 yards rushing, a couple of catches, and scores a touchdown in the game, he has a really good fantasy week. So I would get Najee Harris in your starting lineup if you have that opportunity. Love Najee for the week. Tony Pollard, another running back that we have here as a start for the week. He's going up against the Miami Dolphins, who really haven't been great stopping the run on the season. But this is going to be a week where last week we saw Miami really struggle to move the ball in any kind of way without Tua Tagovailoa. And so without Tua in the game, it makes it kind of challenging. Like if Tennessee comes out to the early leads that they've had, I doubt that they choke them away against Miami. But this gives Tony Pollard a really good opportunity to score more fantasy points and to get the ball in his hands a little bit more. Miami has also struggled against the run. They've allowed rushes of 10 or more yards to opposing running backs a bunch this season. It's the 5th highest rate in the NFL. So this should be a game where Tony Pollard does break off some bigger runs. I know Pollard had a tough week last week, but he had a good first 2 weeks of the season. I think he should bounce back this week against Miami in a really positive matchup. I did want to give the fantasy points per game that the defense has given up. Let's reload the page and see what we got. Probably should write these down, to be honest with you. Just being transparent. Miami's given up 26.2 fantasy points to the running back position. So this to me is a plus matchup for Tony Pollard against Miami. Even though it's on the road, I think Pollard's going to have a really good week, and you're going to want to get him in your starting lineup. Moving over to the Carolina-Cincinnati game, we have Deontay Johnson versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Deontay Johnson, he's kind of been, I'm not going to lie, he's been a little bit of a roller coaster to start the season. He's been a little bit of a roller coaster to start the season here, getting 3 fantasy points and 4 fantasy points with Bryce Young at quarterback the last 2 weeks. Last week, he had 86% of the snaps, 14 targets, 8 receptions, 122 yards, and a touchdown. As soon as they put Andy Dalton into the game, it made huge differences for Deontay Johnson. And now the big thing for Deontay Johnson, obviously, is you hope that he continues that production with Andy Dalton and goes, week to week with that. But he is a ridiculous wide receiver in an offense that is dying for wide receivers. And if they continue to get him the ball like they did in this past game, it's going to be positive for him. It's elite volume that you're looking at for this guy if he does end up producing like that. Now, he is playing the Cincinnati Bengals this week, and Cincinnati on the season so far haven't been the worst defense in the league in terms of giving up points to the wide receiver position. 21 fantasy points a game to the wide receiver position. So they're kind of been a tougher matchup for people. But like I said, this is a game where if you're starting to see high-end volume for Deontay Johnson on a week-to-week basis, unlike he had his first week, and I think this week is a signal to that, where he got 14 targets. I don't think he'll get 14 targets in the game against Cincinnati. I think he'll probably hover around 8 to 10. But if he's getting high-end volume and he's catching those passes and putting up yards and scoring touchdowns, obviously that changes things. It's Carolina, so I don't know if the touchdown thing is going to happen, but I do know he'll get 7-8 catches and probably lock up 70, 80 yards. And at that point, he's a great start. 15, 16 fantasy points would be a solid projection for him on the week against a team like Cincinnati. I also would have to think that, last week Carolina played the Raiders. I think that was a closer game if I remember correctly. They're playing Cincinnati this week. Cincinnati's trying to have a get right against Carolina, who's one of the worst teams in the NFL. So in my mind, this is going to be a game where Carolina's going to be behind. They're going to have to throw the ball a lot. And if Deontay Johnson is on the field and he's playing, which he's going to be, there's going to be a lot of opportunity for him to have success. So for me, the name of the game is opportunity, opportunity, opportunity. And as long as he's getting high-end volume, he should be in your starting lineups. I'd like to see it for a second week in a row, though. So throw him in your starting lineup, get him in there. If he doesn't have that, we need to have a longer discussion about Johnson and what his fantasy impacts are for the remainder of the season. Next guy, we'll head over to the Washington Commanders, Arizona Cardinals game and talk about Marvin Harrison Jr. Now, MHJ is probably in your lineup if we're being real. Like, he's probably in your starting lineup in a lot of ways, shapes, and forms. So I would have to go out on a limb and say that you're probably already starting Marvin Harrison Jr. But the concerns, for him early in the season have just completely dissipated. They just completely vanished and disappeared. He had, in week 1, 3 targets, 1 catch, 90% snap percentage. Didn't get the ball at all. And then against the Rams and then against Detroit, he had 29-17 and he had basically 19 targets in those 2 games. So you finally got high-end production from Marvin Harrison. He's really the only elite receiver that the Arizona Cardinals have. Michael Wilson's okay, but Marvin Harrison Jr. is the guy in this offense. I think 15 to 16 fantasy points is probably a good projection for him. Going up against Washington, though, is the reason why he's on this list, because Washington gives up 44 fantasy points to the wide receiver position. If you're looking for a deeper play this week for a second flex, Michael Wilson, not a bad idea. If you're in a really deep league with 3 or 4 flexes, maybe Greg Dortch is not a bad idea. A lot of fantasy points to go around for the receiving core in Arizona that's cooking right now, going up against one of the worst secondaries in the league in the Washington Commanders here. So I think it's a good matchup, but I bring him up only to talk about him in the context of, at this point, if you were worried about Marvin Harrison Jr. week 1, you should not be worried about Marvin Harrison Jr. anymore. He is a wide receiver that is a bona fide chef running routes. So he will be fine on a week-to-week basis, and you should continue starting him moving forward. I probably won't mention him again on this show, but I wanted to bring him up today because I do think this matchup in particular is a saucy one for Marvin Harrison Jr. Okay, let's move on to the quarterback start of the week here, which is Sam Darnold at the Green Bay Packers. Okay, matchup-wise against Green Bay, not the best in the world, I'm going to say. Green Bay has actually, they've had a middle-of-the-pack defense, according to giving up fantasy points to the quarterback position. They've given up about 15 points to the quarterback position, which ranks as the 20th hardest, or I don't even know how you say that, but 20th easiest matchup in the league. So 15 fantasy points a game to that position. But I do think Minnesota has been cooking lately. This is a divisional matchup. There's other things going on and surrounding this situation. And I think, to me at this point, looking at Sam Darnold, this is where things kind of come into fruition. Is that he's had in 3 weeks here, I believe 15 fantasy points, 20 fantasy points, and 23 fantasy points so far on the season. He's thrown a total of 8 touchdowns in 3 weeks, and he leads the league in passing touchdowns. He's been very, very, very good, and at this point in time, he might be a guy that you want to start on a week-to-week basis. He's been a top 5 quarterback, so I wouldn't mind starting him against Green Bay on the road. He seems to be good to go. He was dealing with some kind of knee issue coming out of the last game, so I think Sam Darnold is a dude for this game coming up, and I think he should be good to go in this game. Obviously, like I said, it's a little bit tougher of a matchup for him So this isn't matchup based. This is more of like he's been producing really well, even against tougher defenses. But Houston has one of the better pass rushes in the league, and there's one specific note that I saw the other day that kind of was interesting because Sam Darnold has been one of those quarterbacks that sees ghosts a lot. And Houston has a really good pass rush, but their offensive line has given up a pressure rate so far this year of 40%, and Sam Darnold is still putting up these numbers, being the QB5 in fantasy football, and he's just been cooking in Kevin O'Connell's offense. So to me, I think he's dealing with the pressure properly, and as the Minnesota Vikings offensive line gels and meshes a little bit more, and they stop giving up such a high percentage of pressures, Sam Darnold will do even better, I think. So I think he's a good start this week, and you should get him in your starting lineup, especially if you don't have a quarterback on your team. So if you're on the low end of the spectrum and you're like, I don't know who to start. I have Trevor Lawrence. Do I start Lawrence? Do I start Sam Darnold? Start Sam Darnold. All right, tight end start of the week. I miss Rick doing this. This is Rick's thing. But the tight end start of the week is Brock Bowers versus the Cleveland Browns. And I bring this guy up too because Brock Bowers, he did have a tougher week this week, but I don't even think that it was really that tough. He had 11 fantasy points week 1, 18 fantasy points week 2, 7 fantasy points in week 3, so he kind of dropped off a little bit. And in these games, he's had 8, 9, and 4 targets. So obviously the 8 and 9 target share makes it double take a little bit and go, whoa, this guy could be good. But then you have a tough situation out here where he does get those 4 targets. I almost traded for him off of the friggin' 17 targets that he got in the first 2 weeks. Now he's only got 4 targets this week. I think at this point, Bowers is a week-to-week start. I think you have to get him in your starting lineup on a week-to-week basis, especially if you drafted him at his ADP. He probably is a starter for you anyway. But the reason why I put him on this list, I think, is specifically because if you weren't starting him to begin with, like in our home league, he fell like all the way to the 8th or 9th, maybe 10th round, I think. So he wasn't drafted as high as he normally is. And so a team had him essentially as their backup. And it's like, if you have Brock Bowers as your backup on your team, all the power to you. I don't know who's your starter, but Bowers should be in your starting lineup. And I think this is a guy that, if efficiency continues for him, can be a Travis Kelce-like tight end in fantasy football, especially if the production continues. I like him way more than I like the guy at tight end 1. So Brock Bowers, get him in your starting lineup. Against Cleveland, though, Cleveland has given up somewhere in the vicinity of 7 fantasy points, 6 fantasy points to the tight end position. So I think Mr. Brock Bowers will blow that out of the water, and he should have a really good week at home. He should be in your starting lineups anyway, but I just want to. This is a nudge. This is a nudge to get you to put this man in your starting lineup for the week. Okay, I think that is all I have for you on this episode. So your starts. These are your starts for the week. Najee Harris, Tony Pollard, Deontay Johnson, Marvin Harrison Jr., Sammy D, Sam Darnold, and Brock Bowers. Hopefully you enjoyed the starts version of this show. The next one, we're going to talk about must-sits. Be sure to check that out, and then check out trade targets on Sunday. So glad talking to you guys. See you in the next one.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Champions Podcast. Make sure you subscribe on iTunes and YouTube, and follow us on Twitter @TheFFChamps.